Hey everybody, Fred Alcoholic. Pretty awesome to get to speak at the tech workshop. This is like a little bit of a dream come true. It's been like my involvement with general service has been like a little bit discouraging, to be honest, based on kind of like the responses I've seen to kind of the considerations around technology, and the conversations haven't really been very nuanced, and a lot of times it's very fear driven. So it's so exciting to be surrounded with people who are thinking about this stuff a little bit more carefully and creatively, and I'm just like thrilled to be a part of this. So like thanks to everybody who's here, and for those of you who are involved in organizing it. Bear with me, like many sleepless nights working on my area website instead of these presentations. And so this is the first time I've ever really even talked about conversational back channels in any kind of AA forum. So I'm sort of winging it. The slides might look really nice, but who knows what's going to come out of my mouth. So the reason why I'm talking about it is because I do think that this has the potential to increase engagement at assemblies and at events like this. And yeah, so it's totally relevant. Here we go. All right, so first, kind of a working definition of what I'm referring to when I say conversational back channel. It's a real-time online conversation alongside the primary activity. It's a term that comes from linguistics. It refers to kind of the behavior of the listeners while someone's speaking. And so, yeah, okay, so there we go. Get that out of the way. All right, so the first time I ever encountered a conversational back channel in practice was at Social Media Week, which is an annual conference that takes place in many cities across the world, and I'm from New York. I don't know if I mentioned it. I'm the web chair for Area 49, Southeastern New York. And I went into the room, I don't know how many years ago, it was a while ago, and they had a hashtag specific to that panel. And they had a computer connected to a projector, much like this, that had a saved search for Twitter hashtags. And it was the search was for that specific hashtag. So anyone in the audience could tweet with that particular hashtag, and it would surface on the screen alongside the panelists. And so it was kind of this very interesting feedback loop would take place, where the people who are normally kind of passive and sometimes half asleep, right? That's kind of how audiences go once in a while. They were able to speak to one another and kind of be a part of it as it was happening. And I got to kind of witness like a different kind of engagement. What was also sort of interesting is because the panelists could see it, it was informing their remarks. Subsequently, I looked further into it. I used to be a chess teacher, and I was doing lots of stuff with technology in my classroom. So we weren't doing quite this, but in my research, I found that it's being used in a lot of classrooms too to kind of like increase engagement. Imagine if you're the teacher and you're lecturing and suddenly you know what the students are confused about while you're talking and can kind of redirect your remarks to answer those questions. So there's some interesting applications out there. Not aware of it being used in AA, of course, like a lot of technology. This setup doesn't really look so hot to me because it's behind the panelists. Like if you're going to surface it like that, it makes it more sense where to the side so the panelists can kind of see it. But this gives you like a sense of how the Twitter conversational back channel could work, which PS I don't think would work for AA. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Slack. Slack is sort of the dominant player right now in the team messaging, app messaging space. They sort of created this space in many ways, or at least like the way it is now, and they're continuing to dominate it. They've made it like, in a weird way, like almost fun to use. They've sort of like taken a different approach instead of like the very corporate kind of approaches that typically happen along those lines. They like made some very conscious like design and UX choices to almost like make it fun and very easy and simple, kind of a different vibe. So I was using it at work, and I've helped a couple of companies kind of adopt it and use it. And on my way to NAATW, the Northeast Regional AA Service Assembly, I was listening to a podcast and Reply All, and they were talking about how they're in like a social Slack team. Like it's not work related, it's just a couple of people that, you know, are interesting people that want to talk to each other, and they were using Slack. And I never thought of it like that. And I was like, oh my God, I've been thinking about this conversational back channel idea for a little while, and I just didn't know how to execute it. Like, Twitter was not a good fit. I really didn't know how it would work. And I was like, wow, I think Slack in many ways would be perfect. So I went rogue, as is my nature, and I just spontaneously spun up a conversational back channel at NAATW to mixed feelings from the people that found out about it. And about 25 people started using it. And what was kind of encouraging was universally they had positive things to say about it. And so just to paint a picture, like, imagine a room many, many times the size of this, where it's literally standing room only. There's people like lining the back walls. You can barely see all your way to the other end of the conference, and they have 3 or 4 like aisles with a microphone. That's how many people they had. And they'd have lines going on each one, and they go 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1 for people to speak. So it's a huge room. And so there was those of us in this Slack team that didn't even know one another and were on totally different sides of the room. And as people were talking, we were able to kind of communicate with one another and have a conversation during the extremely dry finance conversations, which were, had some of the least attendance. Part of the reason why is they're talking about numbers. I'm actually a pretty smart dude, and I am not able to make sense of all your numbers on the fly from the microphone. But I was able to find the document and drop it into the Slack channel. And while everyone else was kind of being like, I have no idea what he's talking about, those of us in the Slack team were able to read along and have a much more meaningful, engaged experience. So that's kind of like a little anecdotal story to tell around the first time I tried this. Actually, I should have skipped to this slide. This is the program from this past year's NAATW, and you'll notice that the panels were organized by these overarching topics: public information, literature, art traditions, etc. So we had a channel for each of those general topics, and so the conversations were segmented to those specific channels. What's my next slide? Okay, so here's a picture of what Slack looks like, and on the left-hand sidebar, you can see examples of channels. This is the one that I created for this workshop today. It's live. There's like, I don't know how many of us are there, maybe like 6 or 7 or 8. Yeah, this is before it was active, really, just to give you a little picture. Here's a screenshot from a Slack channel at my job, just to give you a sense of what it looks like when people are actually using it. And you see, like, there's a link to a document, and people can comment on things and direct mention one another. Kind of part of the philosophy behind it is to encourage, like, a lot of transparency and a lot of fluidity. Like, it's very easy to create channels or get rid of them or modify them. And by definition, channels are all public. So anybody that's part of the Slack team can participate and see what's happening in the channel. It's by invitation only, by the way. And I should have also mentioned that it has a very robust privacy policy. So it's like you need to send somebody an email to invite them into the Slack team. So it's not like a free-for-all. Like, one of the things that I've heard that I've been disconcerted by is there's been certain young people's conferences and conventions that were using, I think it's called Yap, right? And Yap is like a social network that's like geographically defined. It basically, anybody can use it within a mile radius, so it's not anonymous. And so I view this as kind of a counterpoint to that in a way. It's sort of like achieving some of the same functionality, but kind of like with a lot more consideration of our traditions and kind of trying to leverage technology a little bit more responsibly. Not to throw those guys under the bus, but I do think like there's a certain counterpoint to be made there. So potential benefits, facilitates, let's go like that. Was that any better? No? Okay. How's that? Can you guys still hear me good? Okay. So walking through some of the potential benefits, it facilitates deeper and broader participation. I think one of the paradoxes of a conversational back channel, and a lot of times this is a generational divide, I think, is how the hell are people going to be paying attention if they're looking at their phones? And it was kind of hilarious when Brock was reading his little announcement, like, put away your phones. And I'm like, oh man, I'm about to talk about conversational back channels. I don't know how this is going to work. But anyways, so like, if I'm speaking up here and I'm not occupying your full attentional capacity, I'm probably going to lose you, or at least some of you. Our brains wander off. Like when I was at NAATW and I'm looking around at the people looking at their phones, the 25 of us that were on Slack were paying really close attention. The other people that were on their phones were on Facebook. You know what I mean? So if you don't have somebody's full attention, you're going to lose them a lot of the time. And so paradoxically, what this does is it gives people that remainder of their attention that they don't need to pay attention to the speaker. Like, they have enough brain power to do that and maybe do something else. That gets invested in the activity. If you have to read along what other people are saying and contribute and also listen to the speaker, you better believe that takes your full attentional capacity. So paradoxically, people are much more deeply engaged. By broader participation, think about like the quiet voices that might be intimidated to go to the microphone. Or, you know, there's instances in which accessibility might be an issue, and this could facilitate some kind of participation. So I also think this is a way to invite broader participation. I'm going to elaborate on that in a second, I think, if I remember how these bullets go. So accessibility, we've heard a lot about that today, and I'm certainly not the most qualified to speak to that, and I don't pretend to have direct experience with a conversational back channel facilitating that. So I'm just going to highlight that as I think what could be a potential benefit. Somebody who is deaf or hard of hearing could be able to follow along or potentially contribute in a way that they might not be able to otherwise. Crowdsources experience and knowledge. I think like too often, even though in AA, you know, like we're like this upside down triangle and nobody's an expert and et cetera, I think like we're human beings. And so like the person in front of the room with the microphone comes from a certain place of authority kind of a thing. And one of the things I like about a conversational back channel is we're able to mine a much greater wealth of experience and knowledge because you can tap into the whole audience. It's not just the person who happens to have the microphone who can contribute. You can almost like crowdsource people's experience and wisdom and also their access to information. So like, you know, the way I was able to grab that financial doc, or when a whole bunch of websites were being mentioned earlier, we were dropping links to those websites in the channel and kind of going back and forth about them a little bit. So I think there's a lot of potential there. Amplifies quieter voices. I kind of already talked about that. And mitigates the bleeding deacon effect. So, like, if you, what I've noticed, like, and this is like sort of anecdotal, is there's so many well-intentioned GSRs who come once, who come twice, who come 3 times to assembly. They don't really have the context to totally understand what's going on. People are arguing about $5 for a bus or something. And it's kind of like, wow, I just spent my whole Saturday here. Do I really feel like I advanced AA's primary purpose? Do I really feel like I made a meaningful contribution? Do I really feel my group's like better represented in AA as a result of participating in that? I think that's a really common experience, and we have a high, like to use a website term, like a bounce rate. People who come, check it out, and they leave, and then you don't see a GSR from that group until the rotation's up, God knows when, like 2 years later. And so I think like all institutions, and this is not specific to AA, have a certain degree of institutional memory. And the institution starts to form to work for the people who stick around. And so I think like our general service structure to a certain extent, at least I can speak to my area, has kind of subtly developed in a way that prioritizes the needs of people who have been deep in that service world for a long time. And I think it's a very subtle thing, but I think it's so important that we call attention to that and look at how we can kind of balance the playing field a little bit more and invite those newer voices and those less experienced GSRs and find a way to get them over that hurdle where there's so much drop-off. And I think something like a conversational back channel has potential to do that. It can be intimidating to go to the microphone and ask a question in front of a giant group of people when you're a new GSR and you don't know what's going on. And you see somebody who, you know, carries himself like the eagle from the Muppets get to the microphone and they're talking about how it's been for a really long time and they're citing Robert's rules and you have no idea what's going on. You're a lot less likely to go and ask what you might perceive to be a stupid question or you're not sure. And like that's very normal. And so this kind of almost allows for a more incremental onboarding process where people can kind of contribute their voice in a way that doesn't come with the same intimidation factor and where people can answer that person and they can kind of have a back and forth without having to go through that super formal process in that channel. So I think this is one of the ways we can kind of change how our assemblies work in such a way that creates a different kind of balance of influence in the assembly. Because otherwise you wind up with like a group of people who have a wealth of experience who become almost like a priestly class of the assembly. And I'm much more interested in seeing how we can really democratize knowledge and influence and have the group conscience really be just that, a group conscience that kind of bubbles up organically from the contribution of everybody, regardless of how you fit into the mix. If that person group elected them in GSR, then you better believe they deserve to have a voice and a vote and be equally represented. And yes, we have, everybody gets a voice and everybody gets a vote, but when it actually comes to like human interaction, certain dynamics develop that, don't necessarily, principles don't always prevail in that context. And it's something I think we need to look out for. And this could be part of the answer. Not pretending it is. It's more of a conversation starter than anything else. Worth experimenting. So some AA applications. Assemblies and committee meetings, kind of talked about that. And just so you guys know how that works, like you would have a channel, for example, about every agenda item, and so you could keep it segmented and focused, kind of a thing. Presentations, panels, and workshops. Right now, somebody should take, who in the Slack team should take the liberty of creating a Slack channel, so a little meta kind of conversation happen. And service committees, and maybe even TFAA. Now, forget about the TFAA thing, because there was a group conscience the other night to use discourse. I looked in, totally supportive of that. As soon as that's up and running, 100% I'll shut this down. I was sort of really excited about this because I think this is like a way better fit than Lumio is for us. But discourse seems like it would be fine. But in any event, I think this is also a powerful tool for service committees. We used it at NAATW, the New York City Young People in AA, and I know the ECPA host committee is currently using it, and it radically cuts down on email. And it allows people to have like much more productive, constructive, like almost working session conversations. The other kind of thing that's interesting about it is it allows people to collaborate more easily without being in person. It kind of complements your in-person meetings. You're able to have this conversation in between meetings. It's a lot more effective than email. So when you show up, usually your conversation's a little bit more substantive. Okay, so here's a screenshot from the ECPA host Slack team, and I eliminated the identifying information here. And so this was in the Prayer and Unity channel, and they came up with the idea of having a gratitude list through Slack, which I thought was really cool. So it's kind of an internal unity building exercise. So they have a channel called Gratitude List, and people asynchronously jump in there and kind of drop things they're grateful for. And if you look at it, they say, hey, what could we do it at the beginning of our meeting? That might take too much time. What about doing the email thing? Like other people do that. I like the email chain idea, but we could also do it on a Slack channel. That way, when something one of us is grateful for comes up or one needs an uplift, they can go to the channel for it. Yes, Slack gratitude, love it. Obviously, I'm an actor in my spare time, right? You love this dramatic reading? Me too. A channel sounds like a good idea because we won't be inundated with emails from 48 people. Exactly, plus extra points for using the word inundated. So that was like a little conversation I saw that I thought I would take a little screenshot of and share with you guys, which is exactly what I'm talking about. So potential pitfalls. I tend to be like an AA cheerleader about tech, and I think it's really important not to swing in the other direction and just do reckless adoption. I think we should move carefully and methodically, et cetera. Not glacially, however. So here are some of the potential pitfalls. Less positive peer pressure. There's definitely some folks in my area who say disunifying, hateful things at the microphone. And it takes a lot more guts or insanity or whatever to walk up in the front of the room and do that. It's a lot easier to do it when you're just on your phone. That's a well-documented phenomenon that people are way more likely to say, unskillful things, to put it politely, on through chat than they are in person, right? So I think that's one of the concerns I would have, is that it could devolve into some Looney Tunes saying some hateful things. The effortlessness of disable user link, which is kind of a corollary to that. To eject somebody from a meeting or a group, it's not that easy to do. And it usually goes pretty slowly, and you have a business meeting about it, and I think that's a good thing. I don't think our default instinct should be to throw people out of AA when they behave poorly. By the way, just as an aside, you can eject somebody from your group. You can't ban somebody from AA, but you can eject them from your group, and you probably should if they're threatening the safety of your home group's members. Just as an aside, nevertheless, like we should be really careful about doing that and not be like reactionary about that. And the ease of this link of disable user kind of invites moving too quickly with that. So I think that's something to kind of carefully consider. You can easily kick somebody out. I also think, like, unlike most things when we talk about the digital divide, this is something that actually might contribute to the digital divide in a real way. Like, I think I am really comfortable switching between my phone and my computer and multitasking during a workshop, during an assembly. And I think there's a lot of people that aren't, that just didn't grow up with the same kind of stuff or social norms or whatever. And so I don't see this being adopted by a lot of people. I do see it like being I'm so comfortable with the phone itself, that I don't need to expend any extra like kind of brain power in navigating it. I can just engage in the content. But that's not true for everybody, you know what I mean? So I do think there is some potential for this to create a digital divide in an area assembly. So that's something to think about. And there's also a steeper common courtesy learning curve versus email. I feel like people, in my experience, like people just don't know how to use email really. And like, I don't mean like they don't know how to click the send button. I mean, they don't realize like that, hey, you should have like spent a little bit extra time on that instead of sending me 3, or please keep it in the same thread, or please you use BCC if you're mailing a giant group of people, or I didn't need that email. I didn't need 5 people to reply saying thank you. Like, I have a job. Like, keep it easy. You know what I mean? So like, there's like common courtesy around email that I think we could stand to improve on. But I think it would be even steeper with Slack. Like, I think when people first adopt Slack, they go a little Slack happy and they start dropping in emojis and hey, hello, and then suddenly your phone's like buzz, 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 and that's not a good look either. So that's another potential pitfall. Okay, so this is the page you're going to get to once you hit join, and there's a username field. I suggest you do your first name, dash, and then area and the number. And if that's already taken because somebody from your area has the same name, which I think is unlikely, just add your last initial to your name. Keeping a same naming convention makes it a lot easier to find one another and direct mention people. And then you choose a password. And you can uncheck this box if you don't want to get occasional email from Slack. Slack 101, there's channels on the left, hand sidebar. There's also below that going to be people's usernames, so you can direct mention them one-on-one. A little bit below that is private groups, so channels public, anybody can join and see what's going on. You could form a private group, though, if you wanted to invite specific people. You can go into your notification preferences and disable emails, which I suggest, so you don't get spammed. It kind of defeats the purpose of Slack to get emails about what's happening in Slack. You can, of course, also change your notification preferences on your phone if you don't want it buzzing. And just a cool thing to shout out is the file sharing. You can drag and drop a PDF or put in a Google Drive link or a JPEG or anything you want. And most file types will kind of load in a way in Slack that makes them like more interactive, and it's not just like a crazy Google Drive link, for example. It'll like reformat so you can comment on it and stuff. And oh, look at that! I see. I did this like on an hour of sleep. So there's the there's the phone number. Okay, that's it. Thanks, guys.
Let's give Fred a hand.